Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are exploring a really pivotal 21-year period, the Road to Revolution, 1754-1775.
Yeah, a critical time.
And we're jumping into the source material here, which asks this huge question. How does what starts as basically a squabble about economic policies?
Yeah.
How does that blow up into a full-blown revolution? One driven by irreconcilable differences over cherished political principles.
It's a fascinating transformation.
And the sources, they describe the Americans as being, reluctant revolutionaries. So we kind of need to unpack how reluctant they really were.
That reluctance is key. And, to understand it, we have to start thinking globally. This whole era, it's just defined by this intense struggle for North America. You've got Britain, France, and various American Indian nations all competing fiercely for power and economic advantage.
Right.
And this leads directly to the 7 Years' War, which is this massive worldwide conflict. And that war, that's the engine, isn't it? It creates the debt that fuels everything else, the whole push towards independence later on.
Okay, so let's set the scene for that global collision.
Yeah.
Before the main event, there were earlier clashes, right? King William's War, Queen Anne's War.
Exactly. And those are mostly, pretty rough, primitive guerrilla warfare. British colonists against French coureurs de bois, the woodsmen, and their native allies.
But things really shift when everyone starts looking at the same piece of land. Super valuable real estate.
Precisely. The focus zooms right in on the Ohio Valley. Now, for the British colonists, especially those land speculators pushing west, and the Washington family was definitely involved there, the Ohio country looked like a golden opportunity. But for the French, it was absolutely vital. It was the land bridge connecting their Canadian territories with the lower Mississippi Valley and Louisiana. They just couldn't afford to lose it.
And the spark, it comes from a surprisingly young figure, George Washington, only 21, a surveyor.
Yeah, Virginia sends him out in 1754 to stake their claim near Fort Duquesne, that's future Pittsburgh, and he ends up firing on a French patrol.
Which escalates quickly.
Very quickly. Leads to his own surrender, pretty humiliatingly, at Fort Necessity, this little stockade he threw together, July 1754.
Wow, so this local skirmish just blows up.
Explodes, really. What starts as the French and Indian War here becomes the 7 Years' War globally. A true Seven Seas War, fought in Europe, the West Indies, the Philippines, Africa, everywhere.
And the British effort eventually gets organized by William Pitt.
William Pitt, yeah, the organizer of victory. Great nickname. He makes this really smart strategic shift, focus on conquering Canada.
Yeah.
But the fighting in Europe was so intense, so costly for France, that Pitt famously said, America was conquered in Germany. Basically, France bled itself dry defending its European interests.
But before Pitt gets things under control, there's this early attempt at colonial unity, the Albany Congress in 1754.
That's right. The immediate goal was practical. Keep the Iroquois tribes loyal. They literally handed out 30 wagon loads of gifts as bribes.
And this is where we get that famous cartoon.
Benjamin Franklin's Join or Die. The snake cut into pieces, representing the colonies. Powerful image, showing how vulnerable they were if they didn't band together.
So Franklin's pushing for unity even then.
He was. And he proposed a kind of plan for colonial home rule, like an early federation. But nobody went for it.
Really? Why not?
Well, the individual colonies thought it gave too much power to a central body, and London, they thought it gave the colonies way too much independence. Shows you the divide already, right? Even in the middle of a war.
So the war wraps up eventually. British win big at Quebec in 1759. Wolfe's famous battle.
A daring victory, yeah. And the Treaty of Paris in 1763 formally boots France out of North America entirely. Britain's the undisputed global superpower.
There's a cost.
A massive cost. That staggering debt, $140 million. And honestly, you can't overstate how important that number is for everything that follows.
Okay, so let's talk about that aftermath. The war's over, Britain won, but things aren't settled.
Not at all. There are these unintended consequences, colonial confidence, sky high. They felt they'd fought bravely. But there was also huge friction between the professional British officers and the colonial militia. The Brits often looked down on them, called them undisciplined boors.
Ouch.
And maybe most critically, for the Native Americans, losing the French was a disaster. They lost their main diplomatic tool, playing the European powers off against each other.
And that leads to more conflict almost immediately.
Right away. Pontiac's War in 1763. The Ottawa leader, Pontiac, unites various tribes to push back against British settlement and, the end of French gift-giving diplomacy. They besieged Detroit, overran British posts, killed thousands of settlers.
And the British response? This is pretty shocking.
It's grim. They retaliated in at least one instance documented by the sources with biological warfare, distributing blankets infected with smallpox to the tribe.
Oh, okay. And Pontiac's War leads to a major British policy change.
Yes, the Proclamation of 1763. London draws a line down the Appalachians and forbids any settlement west of it. Their thinking was, stabilize relations with the Indians, avoid costly frontier wars.
But the colonists didn't see it that way.
Not even slightly. Land speculators, pioneers, they saw the Ohio Valley as theirs. Won by conquest, they basically ignored the proclamation. Thousands of wagons just rolled west anyway, right past the supposed line.
That defiance. It shows it wasn't just about land, was it? There were deeper principles at play.
Exactly. Which brings us to the deep roots of the revolution, the ideas fueling the fire. There are two big ones here. First, republicanism. This idea, looking back to ancient Greece and Rome, stressed civic virtue citizens, putting the common good above private interests. And it was naturally suspicious of monarchy and hierarchy.
And the second one.
The influence of the radical Whigs back in England. Colonists devoured their pamphlets. The Whigs were constantly warning about corruption, about the dangers of arbitrary power, especially from the monarch. They preached eternal vigilance against conspiracies to take away liberties.
So this mindset is already there, waiting.
It's absolutely there. It primes the pump. It explains why colonists reacted so strongly, almost violently, to what London probably saw as fairly minor tax measures later on. They were predisposed to see any assertion of crown power as a potential plot against their freedom.
Okay, before we get to those taxes, we need to understand the economic system they were pushing back against. Mercantilism.
Right. Mercantilism was the whole theory behind the empire. Colonies exist primarily to enrich the mother country. Wealth equals power, and wealth is measured in gold and silver. So, colonies provide raw materials, buy manufactured goods. Basically, act like economic children. They weren't supposed to compete.
And the colonists mostly went along with this for a while.
During the period of salutary neglect, when London wasn't enforcing the rules too strictly, it was tolerable. But after 1763, with that huge debt looming, the new Prime Minister, George Grenville, decided the colonies needed to pay their share.
And that's when the fiscal aggression starts.
That's the term the source uses, yeah. First, Grenville cracks down on enforcing the Ord navigation laws controlling trade. Then, the Sugar Act of 1764. This was the first law passed specifically to raise tax revenue for the crown from the colonies.
A new precedent.
A big one. Followed by the Quartering Act in 1765, forcing some colonies to house and feed British troops.
But the one that really lit the fuse was the Stamp Act, 1765.
Oh, absolutely. The Stamp Act. It taxed about 50 different common items: legal documents, newspapers, playing cards, dice, marriage licenses, all sorts of paper goods. And the revenue was specifically to support a new British military force stationed in the colonies.
And the outrage wasn't just the cost, right?
No, the tax itself was fairly light. It was the principle,
Right.
and it was how it was enforced. It attacked fundamental liberties.
How so?
Violators were tried in admiralty courts, no juries. The burden of proof was on the accused. To colonists steeped in the tradition of English common law and the right to trial by jury, this was terrifying. It looked like military justice for civilians. That Whig ideology just screamed tyranny.
And that's where we get the slogan.
No taxation without representation. That's the cry. They argued Parliament could legislate for the empire, regulate trade, sure, but impose direct taxes for revenue without their consent. Absolutely not.
But Grenville had an answer for that, didn't he? Virtual representation.
He did. He argued that every member of Parliament represented all British Ostecs everywhere, whether they voted for them or not. It was a concept totally alien to the colonists.
Yeah, they believed representation had to be direct, local.
Exactly. So this forces them into a corner where they start denying Parliament's authority to tax them at all. A huge step.
And their resistance, it was strong.
Very strong. You had the Stamp Act Congress in 1765, 9 colonies meeting, coordinating. That fostered real intercolonial unity. But even more effective were the boycotts, the non-importation agreements. Groups like the Sons and Daughters of Liberty often used persuasion, sometimes intimidation, to enforce them.
And these hit Britain where it hurt.
In the wallet, British merchants screamed bloody murder. Trade dried up. So Parliament caves and repeals the Stamp Act in 1766, a big victory for the colonists.
But London gets the last word, symbolically at least.
They do. The very same day they repeal the Stamp Act, they pass the Declaratory Act, basically saying, okay, we took back that one tax, but make no mistake, Parliament has the absolute right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever.
So no compromise on principle.
None. London asserts total sovereignty. They draw a line in the sand. Future conflict is pretty much guaranteed.
And it doesn't take long. Enter Charles Townshend. Champagne Charlie.
Yeah, apparently he gave some great speeches in Parliament even when tipsy. In 1767, he pushes through the Townshend Acts. These were light, indirect taxes duties collected at the port on things like glass, lead, paper, paint, and, crucially, tea.
He thought indirect taxes would be less offensive.
That was the hope, that colonists wouldn't object as much if it wasn't a direct internal tax like the Stamp Act, but he totally misread the situation. Again.
Why? What was the problem this time?
It wasn't the amount of tax, it was where the money was going. The revenue was specifically earmarked to pay the salaries of royal governors and judges in the colonies.
Taking power away from the colonial assemblies.
Exactly. Historically, the colonial assemblies controlled those salaries. That was their leverage, their power of the purse. Now, London was paying them directly, making them independent of colonial influence. For anyone looking through that radical Whig lens, this was proof positive of a plot to impose tyranny.
So tensions keep rising, especially in Boston.
Boston becomes the flashpoint, leads to the Boston Massacre, March 5, 1770. A crowd starts hassling a squad of 10 British soldiers, throwing snowballs, taunting them. Things get out of hand. The soldiers fire into the crowd.
And people were killed.
11 casualties, killed or wounded, including Crispus Attucks, often named as the first casualty of the Revolution. Big propaganda victory for the colonists, even though John Adams defended the soldiers in court.
After the massacre, things cool down slightly. The Townshend Acts are repealed.
Mostly repealed, yes. The pressure from British merchants feeling the boycotts again was too much. But, crucially, Parliament keeps the small tax on tea. Why? Just to maintain the principle that Parliament had the right to tax.
Principle again. It always comes back to principle.
Always. And while things were maybe quieter on the surface, the resistance was getting organized. Samuel Adams, the master propagandist, as the source calls him, starts the Committees of Correspondence in Boston in 1772.
What were those exactly?
Basically, a network to spread information and coordinate resistance through letters, keeping the opposition alive. Virginia jumps on board in 1773, setting up an intercolonial committee. These committees are the direct ancestors of the first American Congresses, real infrastructure for revolution.
And then comes the tea crisis in 1773.
Right. The British East India Company is in big financial trouble, so London gives it a monopoly to sell tea directly in the colonies. The tea would actually be cheaper than smuggled tea, even with the Townshend tax still on it.
Sounds like a good deal. The colonists didn't see it that way.
Nope. They saw it as a trick, a bribe to get them to accept the tax, to swallow the principle. For the committed patriots, principle was always more important than price.
Which leads to the Boston Tea Party.
December 16, 1773. About 100 Bostonians, loosely disguised as Mohawk Indians, a symbolic choice perhaps, asserting a separate American identity, board the ships and dump 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor.
A pretty dramatic act of defiance.
Huge defiance, but also massive destruction of private property. And that worried a lot of people, even some who opposed British policies. Conservatives feared it was descending into lawlessness.
And the British reaction is swift and harsh.
Oh, yeah. Parliament is furious. They pass what the colonists call the Intolerable Acts in 1774. These are specifically designed to punish Massachusetts, especially Boston.
What do they include?
The big one was the Boston Port Act, closing the harbor completely until the tea was paid for, devastating economically. Other acts restricted town meetings, allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in England, really cracking down.
And there was another act passed around the same time. The Quebec Act.
Yes, and while not technically part of the Intolerable Acts targeting Boston, the timing was terrible. The Quebec Act dealt with governing the conquered French territory in Canada. It guaranteed French Catholic religious freedom, okay, but it also extended Quebec's boundaries south into the Ohio Valley land the colonists wanted.
Uh-oh.
And critically, it kept French traditions like no representative assembly and no trial by jury in civil cases. Protestant colonists looked north and saw this as a terrifying precedent. Was London planning this for them too?
So all these acts together just solidify colonial opposition.
Absolutely. The response is the First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in September 1774. 12 colonies send delegates. Georgia holds out initially.
And what's their goal? Independence.
Not yet. It's really important to remember this. They're still seeking to redress grievances, to get the Intolerable Acts repealed, to restore the relationship with Britain as they saw it before the Stamp Act.
So what was their most significant action?
Creating the association. This was a huge step. It called for a complete boycott of British goods, non-importation, non-exportation, and non-consumption. Basically, using economic warfare to force London's hand.
Trying to hit them where it hurts again.
Exactly. But things are moving too fast now. The British military governor in Massachusetts, General Gage, starts getting nervous about colonial militias drilling and stockpiling weapons.
Which leads us to Lexington and Concord, April 1775.
The final spark. Gage sends troops out from Boston to seize colonial gunpowder stored at Concord and hopefully arrest rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were hiding out nearby.
But the colonists were ready.
Paul Revere and others ride out to warn them. The Minutemen gather on Lexington Green. The British order them to disperse. They refuse. Someone fires a shot, nobody knows for sure who.
The shot heard around the world.
That's the one. Fighting breaks out. 8 Americans killed at Lexington. The British push on to Concord, destroy some supplies, but then face increasingly heavy militia fire on their march back to Boston. It becomes a bloody retreat for the British. The war has begun.
Okay, so war is on. Let's quickly size up the opponents. Britain seems to have all the advantages on paper.
Overwhelmingly, you'd think.
Yeah.
About 7.5 million people versus maybe 2.5 million colonists.
Uh-huh.
A professional army of 50,000, plus they hired around 30,000 German mercenaries, Hessians. They also had loyalist support within the colonies and, of course, the most powerful navy in the world.
Seems impossible for the Americans, but Britain had weaknesses.
Significant ones. First, distance. Operating 3,000 miles from home base was a logistical nightmare. Supplies, communication, incredibly difficult. Second, leadership. Their generals in America often weren't top tier, and the government back home under King George III and Prime Minister Lord North was often confused and inefficient.
And not everyone in Britain supported the war.
Not at all. Many British Whigs actively sympathized with the Americans, seeing them as fighting for British liberties too. Some even cheered American victories in Parliament. And finally, America itself. It's huge. The colonies were vast geographically. Rebels could lose battles, give up territory, and still fight on. They could trade space for time.
Okay, what about American strengths?
Leadership ends up being a huge asset. George Washington, though he lost many battles, proved to be an indispensable leader who held the army together. Benjamin Franklin was a master diplomat securing foreign aid, and you get crucial help from European volunteers like the young Marquis de Lafayette from France.
And they were fighting on home turf.
Defensive war, yes. That's usually an advantage. Plus, they were largely self-sufficient in terms of food. Agriculture was strong.
But their weaknesses were also pretty glaring, right?
Almost fatal at times. Lack of unity was a constant problem. The colonies were jealous of their own power, reluctant to give authority to the Continental Congress. The Congress itself struggled to raise money and supplies.
The economy was a mess.
A disaster. Congress printed paper money continentals, which became virtually worthless due to inflation. Hence the phrase, not worth a continental. Supply shortages were chronic and severe. Think of Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 and 78. Soldiers freezing, starving, lacking shoes and blankets. Morale was terrible.
But they got help whipping the army into shape.
Yes, figures like Baron von Steuben, a Prussian drill master, arrived and brought much-needed discipline and training to the Continental Army regulars. He really made a difference.
We should also mention who else was involved. It wasn't just white men fighting.
Absolutely not. Women played vital roles. Many were camp followers, providing essential services like cooking and nursing. Others managed farms and businesses back home while men were away. And African Americans participated significantly.
On both sides.
On both sides. Over 5,000 black men served in the Continental Army and militias, but the British also sought their support. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Rhodesia, issued a proclamation in 1775 offering freedom to any enslaved person who fled their patriot master and joined the British forces.
A difficult choice for enslaved people.
An impossible choice, really. Thousands did join the British side, becoming black loyalists. Many were evacuated by the British after the war, often facing uncertain futures in places like Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone.
And one final point the source makes. Not everyone was a dedicated patriot.
That's crucial context. The source emphasizes that only a select minority truly committed themselves wholeheartedly to the cause with selfless devotion. There were also many American profiteers who were perfectly willing to sell supplies to the British Army if they paid in gold, even when the Continental Army was desperate. Patriotism wasn't universal.
So wrapping this up, what's the big takeaway for you listening? This deep dive really shows how the road to revolution wasn't some straight path to independence from the start.
Not at all. It begins with the very real consequences of global war specifically, the massive debt from the 7 Years' War. That debt forces Britain to try and raise money from the colonies.
Right, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts.
And those attempts clash head-on with deeply held colonial beliefs about their rights and liberties, beliefs rooted in ideas like republicanism and the warnings of the radical Whigs.
So they start out just wanting the rights of Englishmen, but the conflict escalates.
It escalates because the two sides have fundamentally different ideas about power, representation, and sovereignty. London insists on absolute authority, as shown by that Declaratory Act. The colonists increasingly insist on a measure of self-government.
Which leads to that final thought to consider. Given London's stance, that absolute insistence on its right to bind the colonies, in all cases whatsoever, was there ever really a chance for the colonists to get the autonomy they wanted without separating?
Or was the clash pretty much inevitable once Britain decided to end that era of salutary neglect and actually enforce its imperial authority? Something to ponder.
Definitely something to think about. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the complex road to revolution.